Good morning. On behalf of the Smithsonian, I want to welcome you back to Claiming Space, a virtual symposium on Black futures, past, present, and potential. My name is Kevin Strait, and I'm a museum curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Our symposium is part of a multi-museum initiative between the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Air and Space Museum, and the National Museum of African Art. Today, our morning kicks off with cyberspace, political activism, and Afrofuturism in the digital age. The Black Lives Matter movement began as a hashtag, and through the further utilization of digital technologies has grown into a global network of activists using technology to organize, protest, and shape the public discourse about race and the societal institutions and structures that support racism. This panel will broadly explore the activism that's emerged in the digital age and how platforms of technology are repurposed as a tool for community building and liberation. This morning's discussion features a diverse and engaging group of thinkers who have produced deeply influential works across the spectrum of Afrofuturism. Our panelists include Claudia Alec, who is a performer, producer, and writer, and the founding artistic director of Smoke and Word Productions. She has produced and directed several works, including audio plays, such as the Grammy-nominated Hamlet. She also serves as a founding executive producer of the transmedia social justice company, Calling Up, and produces performances on all formats, from film, stage, online, and in real life. Dr. Ronaldo Anderson is an associate professor and director of graduate studies at Temple University in the Department of Africology and African American Studies. Ronaldo is currently the executive director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, an international network of artists, intellectuals, creatives, and activists, and is the co-editor of Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness and the Black Speculative Arts Movement, and several other publications. Ronaldo is also the co-editor of the Lovecraft Country Reader and a member of the curatorial council for the Carnegie Hall Afrofuturism Festival in New York City. Tricia Barton is an education technology consultant who explores the relationship between interdisciplinary design, creative uses of technology, and STEM education. For the past 6 years, she has facilitated self-designed STEM curricula that focuses on creative technology and social justice education. Tricia uses culturally relevant projects like Afrofuturism and Afrofeminism as strategies to develop curriculums and activities for students and school systems, including robotic dance battles and virtual Afrofuturistic social justice creations. Her practices keenly focus on studying the motivation of girls and children of color in STEM educational environments. Our moderator this morning is Natasha L. Womack. Natasha is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and independent scholar who is one of the leading experts on Afrofuturism and lectures on the imagination and its applications across the world. Natasha's book, Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, helped introduce the topic to a broad audience. And her other books include the sci-fi novels Rayla 2212 and A Spaceship in Bronzeville, as well as the nonfiction books Beats, Rhymes, and Life, and Post-Black. Once again, we thank you for joining us, and without further ado, here's this morning's panel program. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. This is so exciting. I had a great time watching all of your video presentations, and I strongly suggest for everyone watching us now to check out the video presentations for our panelists to just help you give more of a context for some of the work that they are doing and the beliefs and the things that they're advocating. Thank you, thank you, thank you. When I think about Afrofuturism, I like to celebrate the value of the imagination for visioning, for understanding ourselves, for transformation, social change, and also to kind of engage our futures in our histories. And in so doing, it's also about thinking about these intersections of imagination, liberation, technology, mysticism, and it is just really exciting to think about how we're engaging the digital space, because so much of how we've thought about Afrofuturism, how we've connected as Afrofuturists, how we've even popularized the term Afrofuturism has come through being in the digital space. Thinking about identity, thinking about social change, but also thinking about community. And one of the things that excites me about your work is just how central community is in thinking about Black life, thinking about social change, and thinking about just kind of the evolution of self. And all of you work in spaces where you're engaging community. So with that, Claudia, I'm going to ask you a question. First, let me say, whenever someone has a presentation that's called Resisting Genocide Through Digital Connections, we know that we are reshaping perspective and claiming space as we're doing in this conference. So thank you for being here. And I want to ask you, about your video, because there's a moment where you state that the current world makes us cyborgs by necessity. And this cyborg identity is a metaphor that comes up a great deal in Afrofuturism. Can you tell us more about what you mean by that statement?
Sure. And I feel like this perspective is coming very directly from a disabled justice sort of framework. So if you're a cyborg, if you're an organism that has restored function or enhanced abilities due to the integration of some artificial component or technology that relies on some kind of feedback, that describes my life. So I was designing my life to be, I was designing a life where I could participate in the world. About 5 years ago, I started designing that, and it requires devices. It requires communication devices, and it requires all kinds of different types of machinery. It requires different types of choreography for communication and connection. It requires not only the devices, but the programs and then communities that have knowledge and accessibility to those. And when the pandemic hit, everybody needed all the things I have. Also, frankly, the pandemic is a mass disabling event. So I'm speaking to you from my bed desk. I am definitely reaching deep into the nap ministry. Thank you, Trisha Hersey. So I'm in a space of comfort, but also productivity. And it's one that a lot of us are having to design now, that many people are trapped in home and have to use a device to connect to the rest of the world. Cyborgs by necessity.
Absolutely. And the cyborg metaphor has been used often, even in reference of just, Black life in general. Thinking about W.B. Du Bois, the concept of double consciousness, sometimes that's been used as a juxtaposition to think about the cyborg. I think about Janelle Monáe, her cyborg symbolism, and just this idea of us engaging with these technologies, but also thinking about it. I think it's interesting too, because so many times when we've thought about technology sort of historically, each generation has seen a level of hope with this technology, and we're hoping that it would in some ways liberate us and end some of the isms of the world. I think about in some ways the role of television in the civil rights movement. And some of the earliest discussions about the digital age and the creation of the internet was also tied into how this could be used to create an equal platform. And I'm just wondering, how do you think technologies will always sort of play that role, Ronaldo?
I think they'll help raise questions. I remember there was a time when they said the revolution will not be televised, and that's why I always refer to Anna Everett's article, "The Revolution Will Be Digitized," that she came out with 20 years ago. I think in the relation what we're talking to now, probably three people who I think whose writings shaped this moment in terms of at least how I think about it are probably Mark Derry, Kojo Ishun, and Anna's Everett's work, which was in Social Text 20 years ago. Mark was the idea, when he wrote his article about Black to the Future almost 30 years ago now, almost. he was talking about that idea of a technotopia that the Silicon Valley white guys were trying to come up with at the time, and was looking at the absence of people of color when he was trying to initially theorize about what may or may not happen. And I think there was a brief early moment in the mid 90s where that thought was possible, because the largest march that was done in the mid 90s was around the Million Woman March, organized by Black women online, kind of pushing out that theory of virtual communities and the idea that of organizing movement and change could come as a result of this technology. Because as most people who can remember that time know, that the Million Woman March through mainstream media was largely blacked out when they had their meeting in Philadelphia at the time. And then after that, it goes through a series of leaps in pursuit of this. How do you mobilize virtual communities in pursuit of these goals? With the advent of social media by the middle of the last decade. And then another leap, again, always kind of as a point of departure from roughly around the Ferguson era up to this point, around hashtag politics and other technologies like GroupMe and others that would allow people to mobilize in these imagined communities, pursue certain type of goals at the time, whether they were not well defined, or maybe they only existed in small spaces, but they were kept alive through the technology as a way, out of sight, out of mind, out of prying eyes, on a way for people to communicate across national boundaries, across state boundaries, and as a way of as a form of resistance. And it's always been these kind of spaces where these ideas for change have always been nourished. And in the interest of time, I'll just stop right there.
No, I really enjoy that context for just understanding the role that technology has played, one, in organizing, but two, I think, in this proliferation of identity through Afrofuturism, more specifically. And Trisha, in your video, one of the questions you pose as a point of exploration that you dove into was, how can Black people use technology to heal generational trauma? And I'm just wondering, were there any surprises that you found in your inquiry?
I would have to say yes, because that inquiry led to my own healing. And more specifically, my own healing to institutional, like being in an institution, and more specifically being a part of an, I guess the real question is kind of being juiced, and kind of this idea of the romanticized Black creativity that's being used like throughout. The ice cream that I created gave the space for me to go into different spaces and talk to different people and recognize where our need for technology is coming, and really the question of how much we need space for technology to recognize and respond to us. So for example, like the ice cream that I created, and it's in slide one, one of the people that I showed it to, the first thing that he said was, it was the first time I felt listened to or responded to, which was a very surprising thing, because he was a grown man saying, and I was like, you've never felt responded to? I've felt, like I haven't been heard and I haven't been affirmed, especially in an institutional space when it comes to my identity. But to have technology that speaks to that is really important. So there's this short clip that kind of shows ice cream being used in that sense.
Because I am free, oh, is I.
Now, very powerful. And I think about, just even when I wrote the book Afrofuturism, it part of the reason that people were able to find community around the term is because we were able to connect and popularize the term literally through social media spaces, but then to use technology to express ourselves, to even put into these technology spaces, so that confluence, I think, of being able to use these technologies to put them on shared platforms and to find audiences and engage. It was great for creatives, but it was also great for just the ability for people to connect with these ideas and find community, just beyond, say, their neighborhoods or friends. People didn't feel alone. They didn't feel isolated. And I think that that's one of the real testaments to the popularity of the term, is that people could think about themselves and say, oh, wait, I see myself. Oh, wait, this is me. Oh, wait, and here's more books and creations and activism thinking through this lens. And oh, wow, here's people who I can talk to about it so that I don't feel by myself. Claudia, I'm fascinated by these relationships and community. And particularly as they're demonstrated in this period, like you mentioned, where suddenly we're in a quasi stay-at-home period, moving out of a pandemic, right? And we have relied on these technologies in ways we didn't expect for connectivity and inspiration and understanding. And I'm most fascinated by the level of intimacy in these spaces. And when I'm saying intimacy, I just mean authentic connectivity, which there was a period of time where that it was questioned that was even a possibility. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about what makes home, what makes community in the digital space, and facilitates a healthy BIPOC digital space.
Well, I think that in many of the spaces, we're attempting to do an anti-colonial design aesthetic. Like, we're recognizing that regardless of the digital location or the physical location, many of our spaces are designed to facilitate colonial and capitalist exchange. So how do we really intentionally help to make our digital space, the space where we're connecting and building, one that is not doing that? And that requires a level of access intimacy. That's a term that Mia Mingus coined, where this is not only for disabled folk. It's just that disabled community has to do it by necessity, but access is for everyone. We're living in a world where people are suffering from PTSD, and I know my communities are almost always coming into the space with that. So when I'm designing to collaborate with multiple marginalized communities under siege, I'm designing in ways that are about starting slow, about giving a moment for an access check-in. So like, I'm realizing even in the gorgeous connectivity of this space, there was a formal moment where I didn't have a moment to say to the audience, hi, I'm disabled and I might pull a face. I'm not pulling a face at you or this conversation. I'm pulling a face because one of my muscles is pulling me. Having that inside the choreography of the event, having these moments where we're literally just stopping and pacing for justice, pacing for a more human scale. These are the things that are necessary. So it's less, we are using all the technology. So for instance, Tinu Abiyomi Paul, she has these fabulous Black and disabled Twitter spaces. And you can go to the Calling of Justice website to like get links to all of these things. But in her spaces, there's not only the connectivity that we're receiving through the ear, through the voice, through our voices without an image, just intimately talking to each other. And we're all in our own intimate spaces, and then we're in this imaginative, intimate, safe space. And she runs it with such care. There's another website you go to that has all of the communication agreements on it, because we're agreeing to hold the space with care. These spaces are under surveillance. These spaces are under siege. These spaces are in capitalist spaces that actually aren't for us, but we're producing justice space despite that. And so it really does require not only an intimacy, but an intention.
Intimacy and intention. I love that. Intimacy and intention in the digital space. And I'm laughing because just saying that sounds as if we're in a future that we were just kind of, talking about a few years ago. And I have to say that on the space that where you've aggregated so many of these works and platforms, there's so much creativity that's being used to speak to social justice, using our shared platforms as a mode of theater, and it's just amazing. And the not having to rely on, say, a certain kind of editing to then connect, I think is just so transformative. And I really thank you for putting those together. And, Ronaldo, I'm thinking about Dr. Alondra Nelson and that early listserv community where so many of the people who became what I'll call a first wave, well, I think you would call it a first wave as well, some of our theorists who are constantly using the term Afrofuturism shortly after it was created. I think Dr. Alondra Nelson, because to me, she popularized the term that Mark Derry coined by creating this listserv. And I know that this listserv was a real community. And can you tell us a bit about that and how that community of at the time, some students, artists, emerging activists, led to how we think about Afrofuturism today and how it's in some ways impacted BSAM?
Well, their community, as you said, that was started by a bunch of creatives, writers, like people like Nalo Hopkins who participated in it, Cherie Renee Thomas and others, Paul Miller. That community that participated during what they would call like Web 1.0 on these listservs. Their community was an exchange of ideas, and I believe that archive is at the present being held by somebody at the moment because it's not functioning anymore. They did not necessarily have a coherent framework that they could all agree on in terms of what that looks like, in terms of how do we move beyond a theory into some type of practice. However, it was a useful listserv for them to exchange ideas about what they thought about it because they were coming from different kind of creative matrices. Some people were into comic books. Other people were kind of into just the technological end of it. Some people were literary critics, but it didn't have a coherent ideological framework. And some of it maybe due to the limitations of Web 1.0 at that time of the technology, but nevertheless, it was like a robust community for them to engage in exchange of ideas. Now, as far as BSAM, because at the time I was aware of the community, I did not participate in the Web 1.0 because I was focused on some other research for my dissertation at the time. BSAM is different from the 1.0 wave because we do have a somewhat coherent framework that we operate from. It is primarily for people of African descent, and our framework is definitely has a critique of Eurocentric thought, and then we talk about, because we operate across different geographies, in terms of what the practice is looking like in Canada versus Brazil or versus South Africa or Nigeria or in Europe. So it could be described as a transnational Pan-African entity. So that way the politics of it clearly demarcates who Afrocentrism is working in whose interests, and other people that participate are guests. Okay, in terms of how the politics might work and in terms of how we organize. And I think also different from the 1.0 era, we create spaces for the artists or creatives to come up with ideas to try and earn a living when we have our events. In terms of networking events, I like how some of the young people, when they come to our events, they'll thank us for helping them find their tribe. because a lot of times they're working in isolation, or we get a lot of single mothers who come and like buying our materials because it helps keeping their kids interested in school, and it functions as a space for people to experiment or workshop their ideas. For example, Tim Fielder, his book Infinitum, he started that out workshopping at our BSAM events, and now it has become a award-winning best-selling book, and probably the first original graphically illustrated book of its kind in this century that was not a holdover from some previous author. And so a lot of creative practices come out of our workshops, which has culminated now in our exhibition at Carnegie Hall.
And I have to say, that thinking about these engagement of creativity in the arts with theorists, with practitioners, in some cases with scientists, certainly with people who are looking at how to build technology, is an exciting one. And I think the role, thinking about how the imagination has played a role in these communities as we build is fascinating. Clearly, I'm always excited about the imagination, so I'm going to prioritize that as a bonding element. But to think about how arts engage people in thinking about STEM, particularly in communities of color, is an essential contemplation. And Tricia, can you tell us about how you use Afrofuturism in your work with teens, with communities to think, to speculate, to engage speculative works and thinking about futures, and to engage students in STEM?
Absolutely. I think the most important thing is that we use the speculative to prompt students to disrupt and dissect the common narratives that often leads to like this estrangement or alienation to people of color or girls in STEM spaces that have mostly been dominated by white males, while also giving them like this kind of holistic wellness space to cope with this coping strategies of being in those spaces when we know all kinds of like stress and anxiety, and the acute awareness of feeling like you do not belong is so important. And more importantly, leveraging the students' personal experiences and yielding kind of their identity development, because we don't think about how important, especially with adolescents, is their ethnic identity development is at a very like sensitive space in adolescence. In comparison, while learning about STEM, you need to have those forms of representation. You need to form a language around it. You also need to understand, how do I fit into STEM, and how do I come up with these kind of creative ways? And I thought, as you were talking about Dr. Nelson, I found a quote from your book where it's talking about where she asks if Afrofuturism is Africana or Black people, an estrangement, an invitation around imagination, around science and technology. That's Madam C.J. Walker fits squarely into that. So it's a combination of all of these things, this need, a community needing something. And it's really to combat kind of, well, my hair has to look a certain way because I have to be in this space and I have to code switch between these things, but also harnessing and leveraging the importance of STEM and how creativity to solve a problem for your community can really yield these really interesting outcomes.
Yeah, and you also used your Afrofuturism self-care zine that you created to introduce I don't want to say introduce a concept, but on the zine, you listed this idea of, justice design and Afrofuturism. Can you just talk a bit about justice design and how it interacts or intersects with Afrofuturism?
Sure. I think when I was using kind of certain language, I wanted to make sure it was understandable and welcoming to any eye that comes across it. But there's two specific design points that we're kind of looking at. It's human-centered design, so it's really designing for the needs of somebody else, while also liberatory design, where it's bringing the awareness that liberates the designers to be able to create something for themselves, their community, and implement it in those ways. And one thing that I think is really interesting about how that intersects with Afrofuturist design that we don't always think about is the work that Du Bois was actually doing in the early 1900s with his infographics, and how he was using data visualization to basically dismantle scientific realism and these really hard notes that are still present in our STEM curricula, still present in the way that we engage with each other, about this concept that was created by Wilhelm and I'm getting the names, it was about 1837, but basically saying that Black people or of African descent do not have development and they don't have a future. And how that leads a whole study from social Darwinism and these other forms of studies that we still kind of see effects today, even though they've been proven scientifically incorrect. And Du Bois knew that as well. And he was trying to communicate that with his designs, specifically with those infographics.
Isn't it amazing how prescient Du Bois is?
Yes.
And how we're still working with his frameworks today. And if I may add, Du Bois at one time was a professor at my alma mater, Clark Atlanta University, which just happens to be in the AUC, the same area where Trisha came from. And when one comes from the AUC, you must always reference it. In addition to going to an HBCU, you have to always give this shout out. And I know that Ronaldo came from Jackson State as well. So these are just things I just have to throw out there in case you were thinking about HBCUs in the midst of this conversation. But no, thank you for bringing that up. I'm just fascinated by, again, W.E. Du Bois, his prescience, how we can even use that to talk about cyborgs in a metaphor today, and thinking about our digital spaces. And Claudia, I want to ask you about self-care and how poignant it is in our activism communities. I was looking at a video recently of a prominent activist who was just mentioning that, if some of the activists in the past could have helped to focus on self-care, it may have made a difference in some way. And she didn't specify the difference. But I think that it's interesting that that's come up. It's certainly something, Trisha, that you have explored with the zine you put together. But also it's something that is a big part of our digital spaces for some of our activism communities. And I'm just wondering how our digital spaces are facilitating support for that.
I love that question. And I just want to do a shout out for the zine. Just the shout out for the zine. Trisha, I was literally on a national panel yesterday talking about how if you are not designing for justice, you're designing for injustice. You're baking it into the model. And that's part of the problem. People don't want to acknowledge that they are working with models that have injustice and harm baked into them. And I would actually argue that the entire concept of self-care is problematic. We live in a country that has designed itself to encourage us to do individual care, to think of everything individualistically. Why? Because they wanted to break our tribes. They wanted to break our communities. They wanted to break us up into individual tiny little family units and then break those family units up so we would be easier to control and be less self-sufficient. So I don't desire self-care. I desire a country that does not disallow community care. Literally, I'm living in a paradigm that makes it not only incredibly difficult to just take care of myself, but it makes it hard for me to think about picking up the phone and sending a text message to my community to say, hey, how are you doing? To send a message to someone to say, I just want to send you some love. Now, I'm also just thinking about the patterns and rhythms of society. So like pre-pandemic, I was very intentional to make sure I had walking paths that brought me into accidental encounter with human beings that I wanted to build community with. So that it was not, I'm coming to you in a capitalist framework so we can do a project. It was, I'm running into you while we're at the store. We're going to do a little bit of gardening together. So how do we replicate those kinds of encounters and engagements, cooperative, juicy, building relationship engagements in platforms that are literally designed to have us do the opposite. So I was just talking to my colleagues on TikTok, and we were talking about how TikTok's a plantation, y'all, and we're all sharecroppers. And we were trying to figure out, all right, so yes, that is the case. We live in America. This is where we are at. How do we participate despite that? How do we build healthy exchange despite the fact that the algorithms want us to be in fights? So cooperative care is the thing that I'm thinking of right now. Community care is what I'm thinking about right now. Oh yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. One of the things that's so beautiful about the communities you've aggregated is that it breaks down the screen. And as I've said, I've seen this in theater and what some people would say is experimental theater in this period, but to see it in spaces where people of color are looking for healing and looking for community, and then able to create community in such an authentic way, I just think it's exciting. It's quite exciting because to break down the screen and not feel isolated is a charge that is not an easy one to facilitate connectivity with. So thank you very much for that. How? Oh,
I was just gonna.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on, and just it was wonderful, and it made me kind of generate and think about the difference between an individualist and a collectivist society, and kind of what COVID has done when it comes to the concept about self-care and how everyone is kind of in these different places, and really the question about authentic connecting and what does it really mean to authentically connect in the age of social media and in the age of being digital.
Right. And Ronaldo, do you have any thoughts about Afrofuturism functioning in these digital spaces? How do you think Afrofuturism functions a little differently in these spaces, maybe than some other approaches?
What I've noticed in the movement internationally during this time, it depends on the geography almost. People that are in our network in South Africa have had a different set of issues than they would have in, say, North America. What I've noticed here in North America, it's what's the word I want to use? A certain type of psychological or mental unraveling because of people living in isolation. And it seemed that people who had some type of cohesive group prior to the pandemic seem to be doing better than the people who were living by themselves before the pandemic. But the other thing we're seeing is people who need regular medical care, the access to medical care, like for instance, if your prescription runs out and you can't get in to see the doctor. For example, one of the people who was one of the early creatives around Afrofuturism, Greg Tate, passes away around health reasons. So a lot of people are not seeing getting health care regulated just to check up to see how they're doing because of the healthcare crisis that's going on right now. The other thing that I'm seeing is I don't want to necessarily use the word tribalism per se, but when there's a lack of confidence in the state, then it kind of communication and cohesion or organizing then reduces itself to like clan, kin, and tribe in terms of getting things done. And so, because a lot of people in what they used to call Western developed countries, they wanted less involvement from the state in their lives. There was a recent article that came out that a substantial number of people in Europe would prefer AI as a representing of their interests rather than a human being, because people don't believe in people that much anymore in certain spheres. The other thing is during the pandemic, if you're at a certain income level, or the term I want to use is platform capitalism, where people, you can organize your life around apps, DoorDash, Lyft, Uber, Instacart, Netflix, streaming TV. And so for me, as a person over 50, yeah, I'm using my privilege to isolate from myself from people who don't like taking vaccination shots. You know,
Oh my
so
goodness.
yeah, so I'm just saying, because of that thing where people that don't believe in science, okay, and so that,
And I'm wondering though, as we're formulating, and thinking about these, these community spaces, this juxtaposition of being isolated and yet finding community,
yeah,
isolated yet finding
mhm,
community.
yeah,
This idea of there being, physical community and juxtaposing that in digital space, digital
yeah,
community, juxtaposing that in digital space, and that, just increasing more of this sense of being hybrid or cyborg as a way of lifting. I just think it's really, I almost want to ask, the audience to sort of just sit and contemplate that, particularly since so many of our reliance on these technologies has been exacerbated in the past
mhm,
few years, even with us sharing on the current platform that we're on. And I'm just thinking about, again, this communal care, this self-care is being very central to Afrofuturism. And I'm thinking about STEM again, and thinking about how, even in this period, we're looking to engage the imagination in digital space, and in some cases, physical space, um, to bring people together to value the sciences so that we don't have some of these conflicts that Ronaldo mentioned and some of us have had to really deal with. And I just want to ask you, Trisha, in working, engaging these sort of spaces, what are some things you've had to prioritize in working with young women?
Their identity. I think that's the most important aspect, and really understanding the real existence of otherness and subalternhood, especially when it comes to the intersectional experience of being a Black girl, especially in the spaces of STEM. That is kind of really one of those things that I really highlight in building community and in them encouraging each other. In addition to the arts, as arts gives the skin to the skeleton. It gives the story to what's going to be given to that, and being able to communicate what you're going to be doing. You can have the soft skills of STEM, but if you don't understand why you're doing it and in what ways is it impacting someone's life, if you create something, whether it's a biomedical device or it's a recording camera, using a certain piece of device that's using data, how are you using that data, and what are the ethics with that? And that goes into a larger conversation as well. And then I think another thing is just representation, not just representation in the teacher, but also representation of who they're being shown. I talked a little bit in my video about, Nichelle Nichols, but we don't talk about, I mentioned, Madam C.J. Walker, but there are also just many, especially women of color, that have contributed to so many inventions, specifically to America in the turn of the century, that really changed the way that we engage with each other digitally and on a physical level. With 3D glasses, home defense system, it's a sanitary belt, and the list goes on.
I just always love hearing about Black inventors. It just gives, I'm like, yes, tell me more. But with that, I want to move on and ask our audience for questions. If our audience has any questions that you would like to share, I'm seeing some come in here. And Well, Jacqueline wants to know where she can learn more about self-care and yeah, more where she can learn more about self-care and Trisha's and about justice design. Trisha.
Sure. So the way that we went about using this curriculum is we also created it in a way that it also supports other Black women or other women who are trying to explore or deepen their interests. So we had a movement coach. We had someone that was doing deep breathing exercises and yoga constantly through different spaces, while also taking the giving them the awareness of how to use that as a tool when they recognize that there's something going on in their body. Those resources, I think some of those resources are currently free online on YouTube from Melanin for You. I believe, I know Joelle Marie, she has her own page as well, but I think the real question is the journey of what works best for you when it comes to holistic self-care and being in those spaces. And also you have to have the awareness that I was just in class or I was just in the space and I was triggered and it made me do these different, I then did X, Y, and Z, and being able to have a better understanding and control over your body versus this concept of you don't have control over your body because someone, you received a microaggression and you're acting outside of your character for various reasons. I hope that answers her question.
No, thank you. And go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just going to invite folks to visit the Calling of Justice website and maybe dig deeper into the work of Adrienne Maree Brown and pleasure activism. Get in on that. There's an entire conversation we had that's just like 2 hours of pleasurable praxis. You can learn about it and have a good time while you're learning about it. And then there's a dance party that's a part of it. You can learn more about care work. Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samansara. I fully mispronounced her name, but I'm happy if you Google her on the Calling of Justice website, though. That's another place of knowledge building. And yes to every single thing that you just said, Trisha. I feel like this is not only about digging into the learnings that have already been offered to us, but it's about putting it into practice every single day. So yes to everything you just said.
We have a question from Daryl who wants to know what are other ways we can resist the algorithms that, as you say, Claudia, want us to fight?
Oh, yes. Algorithmic suppression, algorithmic encouraging us to have exchanges of conflict rather than cooperative exchanges. I feel like it's partially about being really conscious, about recognizing that you are on dark paths. Wait, I feel like you're about to say something, Trisha. You go ahead, say it. I'm feeling you.
It's not necessarily an answer, but it's a meditation on really understanding these algorithms and machine learning and how black box they are. And even the people that create them sometimes don't know what they are doing. And so it really is, it's sometimes some people say, how can you, counteract it versus how do you make it work to your advantage? And that's really a question that you can explore with that. If you're looking for something in particular, you will potentially find it based on the time that you look at it. But it's all about clicks, how much time that you spend literally within milliseconds within your eyes of how long you're looking at something. These companies are taking in that data and making meaning of it for them. And so you should be able to make meaning for it for yourself as well.
And just like some of the things people are doing are, there are folks who we've started organizing in Discords. So we're organizing off of the spaces. So we're not only using a Facebook group to organize, but then we're realizing, you know what? Facebook is a space of surveillance and is actually interrupting our communications. Maybe we need to take this conversation to a private Zoom. Maybe we need to take this exchange and build our own mighty network. So there's a lot of different strategies people are using. There's a lot of live conversations taking place in all of these spaces. And I really do feel like we're at a moment where a lot of the content creators, a lot of the folks who are building this, it's almost all Black folks, y'all. Black folks are always the engine of creativity in the United States. So almost every single platform has built billions, an empire of billions off of cultural appropriation machines. And a lot of us are getting hip to that and are trying to figure out what are the ways that we can organize and build community that's not only insight, that's getting all those clicks, but also how are we honoring our ways of having success and power, which might not look the same. It might not look like you have 1 million followers. It might be better to have 20 really safe, good followers that you're building well with. So I feel like there's a lot of different ways the folks is doing stuff. Yeah.
This is so exciting. You know, sometimes when you hear people talk about digital spaces, there can be this almost humdrum, you know, conversation around fighting oppressive technologies. But the enthusiasm that I feel here, I think speaks to the work you're all doing and the excitement about this creativity, and the language, I think, is something that is reshaping how people are thinking about these issues as well. Well, Ronaldo, you are a co-curator of the Carnegie Hall Festival, along with myself and several other luminaries. And we have a shout out here from Mutale, who was talking a bit about how he's looking forward to this Carnegie Hall space. Can you tell us a few things that you'll be working with there?
Well, one of the concepts we're working with that's in the exhibition, actually, where that will be a thread, I think, throughout the festival and some of the other meetings, is this concept of how Afrofuturism is going to engage the metaverse. And that's why we introduced the concept of Salone Quito's idea of the pluriverse. And this other young man who's talking about this non-hegemonic way of dealing with the metaverse, he calls it the gatherverse, in terms of how a lot of the artists with the Black speculative arts movement, we started dealing with the idea of non-fungible tokens before it got big, really last spring. And so, and there's a politics to NFTs, blockchain, and all of that now is alternative ways of around organizing and developing a capital. So a lot of people in the movement are saying what we're doing at Carnegie represents the end and the beginning of something, kind of where we could say from like with your book to Unveiling Visions at the Schomburg was kind of the beginning of it. And the Carnegie Festival is bringing that kind of era to a close. And that this is kind of like a transitionary pivot moment to what's going to happen after post-Carnegie. So the Carnegie Festival is mostly for the mainstream consumption, for people to learn about a lot of what's been going on the last several years. And so I think, I think some of the interesting things I'm excited about now are the international component that has now been woven into the narrative. I'm very excited that young people like Zaika dos Santos from Brazil is getting ready to get some shine. A lot of what the Afro-Canadians are doing, because as you know, the primary artist that represents a lot of the art, Quentin Versetti from Toronto, is going to be very much involved. I know in our own exhibition, Cairo Durajai from Nigeria is presenting some very interesting art. And so, I mean, that's why I'm excited. It's kind of like when I think of the those Harry Potter movies, this is like going to the Wizard tournament. And so, I'm excited about of what's going to happen over the next several weeks with people getting exposed to different concepts, or the Afro-Latinx perspective on this phenomenon, which I remember we were the first ones to introduce in the Bronx 4 years ago with some, and we'll be at the Triple C Dominicano on 145th with that, and also the Francophonie perspective of it with Alan Bedard and his award-winning films.
You know, and I'm just listening to you, say these things, Ronaldo. I know that people are just like, "Whoa, it's so much happening."
Yeah.
And guess where you can see many of these things?
Mm-hmm.
In the virtual space, here in the cyberspaces that we're all a part of. So much programming. It's fascinating how programming has become essential for engaging in these things. And I have to thank you, because some of the work that you're doing could often be seen as, at one point would have been seen as contemplations in an academic sphere. And the question would be, how can you bring it to the community?
Oh, that was, who was key to that was Cherie Renee Thomas. Because a lot of our people don't like coming up on a college campus. And so that's why we're very intentional about, like, when we're in LA, we're down at Leimert Park and we're not on a college campus. Or when we're in Toronto, we're in different spaces. We want everyday people to come through so we're kind of like Stacey Robinson had talked about how our group rebelled against the fine arts people. And it was Stacey that talked about, even though we create great art, we cater to the people that only got like $20 in their pocket, but they want something nice to hang up in their living room. And those people outnumber the $1,000 people. And so, yeah.
Yeah, the ability to get work out in the digital space and to speak to, I think it's cool to just see how there's a leveling and the connectivity through these shared resources, through these shared points of creativity, redefining in some ways what's of value and what isn't, and being able to do so. That challenges sometimes the nature of how some thought of digital space could function.
And
it's
talk to them,
so intriguing.
And talk to them in their own language.
Right. No, totally. I mean, it's
Yeah.
great for everyone to see themselves, and it's quite amazing. I think we may have time for one last question. I'm looking here, and I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
Well,
yes, please.
Well, I was inspired by Ronaldo, and I think this might have been earlier in the conversation. I'm just thinking about the power of our Afrofuturist work to work beyond boundaries of space and time, and how boundaries of space and time have been created to hold us down. It's like the entire concept of how time works is a colonialist concept. So it's about breaking that. I'm thinking about the amazing collaborations where I've been able to record a podcast with somebody who was actually in Palestine, so we could hear the gunshots happening in the background while that was going on, while we're on the call with Black activists and Palestinian activists who worked together in Ferguson. So it was about remembering the connections we had when we were in that physically shared space, but being in this sort of digital liminal space that works beyond those international boundaries. So I just love that you were naming the Canadian folks that you're working with. I'm just thinking about the unsettling dramaturgy convening I'm working with, the perpetual digital watch night, where we had someone from Nigeria just give us magic in real time. We were able to experience drumming in Nigeria. So just a shout out for the possibilities and the praxis that we're all involved in right now, just celebrating it.
Right, because so many times there's a fragmentation in diaspora communities where it was tough, for people to sometimes connect with one another without extension travel. One another's experiences are being mediated by other entities. So to have real-time instant connectivity, to be in some of these chats, to be able to find a creative, if I'm in Chicago and there's a creative who's in Ghana, to see one another's work and to see the similarities in, how we're, approaching Afrofuturism. I think it's really beautiful to think about Afrofuturism as a way that's able to bridge diasporic spaces. And I know that I've always spoken about Afrofuturism very much as a bridge, and a bridge that still respects how people are informed from their specific geographies, where differences are complements.
Well,
it's quite beautiful. Yes.
To second what she said, one thing we always talk about is before the year before the Berlin Conference in 1884, Europeans had a meeting also how to organize time globally. In 1883, that's when they set up Greenwich Mean Time. So to understand the relationship between time, space, and politics, people always want to control time first. Then they can learn, that's how they learn how to control space. And then that will dictate the politics. And once, like, where did this Greenwich, England, the British Empire, imperialism. So a lot of how contemporary time and space is organized was based upon British and American and European imperialism. And that's where all those three components are linked together, which is why we have to operate in sometimes in an ungodly time, because it was based upon something that was decided in 1883, what time was.
Right. And I know for some people that is a point they have to contemplate, like, whoa, wait a minute. I thought time was a given. I thought the nature of space was a given. I thought the design of my mug was a given. But when we centralize design, as you often do in your work, Tricia, that's when you realize, wait a second, someone created these things. Correct. And those creations are backed by a philosophical mindset around how I'm supposed to engage with the world.
Correct. And I was just going to say how with technology, it rechecks our need for time, because our bodies are the ones that make us think about time. But if the technology can exist forever, it kind of breaks past that. So just as we were saying that we're at an interesting time where something's ending and something else is starting, how do we redefine that?
Well, we are at time, everyone. Claudia, Tricia, Ronaldo, you're all amazing. I'm so glad that we were able to have this shared space and we're claiming our space and claiming our spaces in cyberspace, which can sometimes, I think, run parallel to almost kind of ontological, metaphysical spaces as well. And that's always intriguing, these sort of overlaps. So thank you, everyone, for what you shared today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you, audience, for some of these great questions. I hope that you have gained some insights, that you will check out our panelists' work, that you'll check out my work, that you'll look to these symposiums, of course, the Carnegie Hall one, because you have two curators here. So we're bigging that up. And special thanks to the Smithsonian for putting all of this together and having us think about these issues, particularly in this time, this pivotal time for Afrofuturism, a pivotal time for our world, and an exciting time in the ways that people have found community and use these technologies to better understand one another. So thank you again. I can't stop saying thank you. But you're wonderful. Your contributions are much valued. And you, audience, your contributions are valued, and you are valued. And you are here for a reason. And we're so glad that you get to engage with these ideas. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.